A cozy dinner suddenly turned into a battlefield when my son threw his cup of coffee onto my chest. I didn't react, not a word of argument. I simply took out the recorder, set it beside the doctor's report, and everything suddenly went still. It wasn't a noisy retaliation, it was a revenge by means of truth, to mend the wounds with evidence and action. Can that silence have the strength to bring someone back? The morning opened with the dry cold of January pouring through the crack of the kitchen door. The smell of toast still hovered, clinging to a thin, mist-like layer of warmth. On the wooden table, a line of crumbs had fallen in a row, neat as small footprints that had passed and then vanished. The kettle still held heat, no longer boiling, just breathing softly. He stood straight-backed, both hands set on the edge of the table to feel the surface of wood worn glossy under elbows after many years of use. He, 72, wore a thin sweater beneath a heavy coat, checking each pocket as is the habit of someone who has lived long with order. Three things lay side by side on the tablecloth. A voice recorder small enough to fit in the palm, its plastic face faded. A thick envelope of textured stock, the upper corner embossed with the hospital's name and a doctor's slanted signature. A children's library card with a bright scuff on the plastic surface, the word Thursday worn down from being swiped many times. He gathered his breath and moved each item into his coat, giving each its own place. The recorder on the left, close to the heart, the doctor's envelope in the inner pocket where his hand could reach it, but it wouldn't show, the library card in the outer pocket, easy to take out when needed. His hand happened to pause at the porcelain cup he hadn't washed clean last night, a thin brown ring still clinging to the rim. He took a damp cloth and wiped once. The small circle disappeared, leaving a smooth surface. When he set the cup down, the sound of cup meeting wood was dry, light, tidy. By the window, a faint leaf-shaped frost print was stamped on the glass. He tried wiping it with his hand. It didn't come off. The warmth of his fingers only made a clear patch just big enough to see the bare branch in the yard and sparrows gathered on the power line. On the shelf, Martha's picture frame leaned against the wall, the first light of day touching the glass into a thin glare. He lifted the frame. His palm felt the fine dust clinging to the wooden edge. He stroked it lightly, leaving a clean strip, then stopped halfway, as if afraid that if he wiped more, something would be blurred away for good. In the photograph, that smile was still composed, a slim bracelet on her left wrist that used to clack against the sink. A few images flashed by, the smell of waffles on Sunday morning, the rustle of gift wrap, a long silver hair stuck to her sweater each time she hugged. Then it all settled, like warm water just poured into a basin, no longer steaming. He set the frame back on the shelf, tugged it lightly to square it, letting one corner touch the wall for steadiness. The chill from the tile floor threaded through the soles of his slippers, making him curl his toes a little. From the next room, the refrigerator gave one beat and fell silent. On the table, a shopping list written in black ballpoint: bread, milk, cooking oil, tomato seeds, March. He folded the paper in half and slid it into the inner coat pocket in the same compartment as the doctor's envelope, but separated by an old postcard so the envelope's corner wouldn't get scuffed. Papers with textured surfaces, with weight, lay there as if they were bricks shimming a door gap. He went to the sink, turned on the water, rinsed the butter knife, and set it on the towel to dry. The kitchen towel hung back neatly on the hook, two corners square, the old fold forming a faint seam. On the tabletop, he twisted the salt jar so the lid fit tighter. It had once been loose. Tilt your hand and it would slip. Little things like that are easy to forget, easy to loosen. He had learned to set them right and then walk away without asking anyone to notice. Outside the door, the light increased a little. The facing house wall reflected the milky white of a clouded sky. The street was quiet. An early bus slid past, the air brakes leaving a thin hiss, then silence. He looked at the tabletop once more to make sure he hadn't missed anything. The surface bare, a glazed plate with a small chip at the rim, the knife lying right at the edge of the towel. Everything was in place. He pulled the coat zipper halfway and paused to breathe deeply. In his chest, his heartbeat was steady, but not slow. He tried the outer pocket and touched the edge of the library card, a cold plastic face, a nicked corner, a polished streak smoothed by many handlings. From the inner pocket, he felt the stiff envelope pressing against the coat's fold, a sense of reassurance not because the papers proved anything lofty, but because he knew there was something clear to set on the table if needed. The recorder on the left pressed against the wool at his chest. The body of the device warmed gradually with his body heat, not to record what others might say this morning, just a habit. Storing bird song, the squeak of the gate, the names of books to borrow more of on Thursday. He glanced at the empty chair by the table, where years ago a cup of tea used to be set out. The chair hadn't grown much older, only different in that it had grown used to absence. He drew the chair close to the table so it wouldn't jut out, and at the same time picked up a loose thread from the floor, rolled it, and dropped it in the trash. Small acts like that made the room feel tended. When his hand touched the doorknob, he stopped. The pause wasn't long, only the time it takes a person to rebalance their stance. In that moment, his wish showed itself. Very simple, needing no words, a quiet dinner, enough light to see each other clearly without glare. And when someone called, the name he would hear would be Dad, not Asset. The thought passed through him like a thin breath of warmth, not heating him, just enough to take the chill from his cheeks. He switched off the stove, checked the outlet, pulled the curtain one notch farther so the noon light could enter when he came back. The door locked with a small click. Outside, the cold air touched the skin of his face, making his eyes a little sharper. He stepped onto the porch, ran his hand along the wooden railing, worn smooth, then let go. The journey of an ordinary day began, with no sign to foretell it, only the things in their right places, in his coat pockets, and a wish kept inside, neat as a slip of paper folded in quarters. He folded the newspaper along its old crease, the two edges meeting like a door closing softly. The sheet lay flat on the table, the unread news resting still under his palm. He smoothed down the spine once, making a small, straight line, then set it on the bottom shelf, the place where things already used are put to rest. The porcelain cup still had a thin, brown ring at the rim. He opened the tap just enough so the stream wouldn't splash on the glaze, and rubbed lightly in a counterclockwise circle. The dish soap rose into a fine, milk-like film. He rinsed it clean and left the cup tilted on the cotton towel. The last drop gathered at the lip, round and heavy, then fell, leaving a clear, dry trace. Beside it, he snapped the dish towel once, folded it into a neat rectangle, and hung it back on the hook. The hem hung down exactly the width of a ceramic tile, no more, no less. The keys in his pocket touched each other softly as he turned. A small, clear metallic sound, like a reminder that doors would open by his own hand with no one's help, without anyone's permission. He laid his palm on the cooled stovetop, let his eyes travel across the counter, over the small things still in their places. The butter knife pointing in, the salt jar sealed, the cookie tin latched, nothing loose, nothing fidgeting. He stood a little straighter. The breath went in through his nose and out slowly, leaving no trace of a sigh. On the wall, the clock's hands glided, not jerking. He touched the left pocket where the recorder lay against the wool, drew it out. The plastic surface was dulled, nicked by a long scratch like a pencil stroke on old paper. His thumb found the round button. He pressed. A soft, dry click. A tiny red dot appeared. No words were spoken into it, only the kitchen at rest. The clock, the pipe's slow breathing, fabric rasping faintly against skin. He pressed again. The light went out. Both presses were decisive, like setting two small nails into the grain of wood, enough to hold fast, not showy. He opened the drawer, took a fresh tissue, folded it in quarters, and slipped it into the pocket with the recorder. The thin, nameless sheet was set aside for a moment he knew would come. To wipe a drop, keep a line clean, tidy an ink mark, not out of perfectionism only, because he didn't want to leave anything that could be misread. The sink was empty. He took a small brush and swept through the grout where water had clung for a long time, an action that took only a few beats of the clock. Cleanliness did not show itself in glossy white. It showed in the absence of anything tugging his eye away from the things he should do. When he turned the tap, he stopped at just the moment the flow ended with a snug little sound. No drip. On the upper shelf, the glass sugar jar still bore a fingerprint. He lifted a dry cloth and erased it. That hand left no trace. On the cabinet door, a magnet clipped a card from the library about the weekend reading program, the corner slightly curled from damp. He pressed it flat again, then stepped back to take in the kitchen as a whole. Everything was still, as after a thin fall of snow. He took the bunch of keys, tied them back with the small worn loop, and drew them toward his pocket. As he slipped them in, the metal touched once more softer now, because they sat snug. Right after, he tested the coat zipper up a short span, letting it stop at mid-chest, a habitual check, like a tradesman gauging his grip before turning a screw. On the table, a trivet was off by a corner. He straightened it. That small act set off a very slow chain of motions. The chair pushed in tight to the table, the curtain raised one notch at the window, the brass desk lamp turned down one level so the room wouldn't be too harsh when he returned. Each adjustment had its reason, though no one asked. He lifted the recorder to chest height, laid his finger on the record button like a silent rehearsal. If needed, it would be switched on. If not, it would lie there, like a promise not to be used unless the truth needed a place to shelter. His hand lowered. The recorder went back into the pocket, brushing the neatly folded tissue. Passing the frame on the shelf, he didn't touch it again. Pale light fell across the frame's edge, caught a floating thread of dust. Then it dissolved. He left the quiet standing there, no adding, no taking away. Some things need no words, only a steady place. The kitchen door closed behind him with just enough force. The lock turned once, the click sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. He stood a second at the threshold, set his collar for warmth, and walked on. Inside, the kitchen was put in order, saved for a day he would return. Outside, cold air swept across his face, making his eyes a little clearer. What needed saying had been placed where no voice was required. The evidence lay in the inner pocket, the gestures in his hands, and that small click still resonated somewhere in his bones, enough to remind him that today he would follow his own straight line, no arguing, no noise, not losing to looseness. The wooden house stood still in the fine light of a cold day. The brass desk lamp on the shelf by the window cast a soft ring of gold, spilling onto the wood's surface, darkened by years of hands touching it. The fireplace crackled, sometimes giving a small pop like an old person shifting position. On the floor, the wool rug had a corner curled from the table leg, rubbing it over time. He bent and smoothed it flat, keeping his hand there a beat longer so the wool would agree to lie still. In the corner, a soft leather album leaned against the bookcase, the worn corner exposing the board beneath. He lifted the album as if lifting a thing with water inside. Slow, level, not tilting. The smell of old leather rose and mixed with the warm scent of wood. Old photographs, glossy dim, stuck down with glue now stained. Martha's familiar handwriting beneath the picture of the 6-year-old boy learning to ride a bike in the front yard. First day riding on his own. The strokes were fine and even. She had written the word own a shade darker, as if fixing belief in that very moment. He set his fingertip on the edge of the photo, careful not to touch the printed gloss so as not to leave a mark. His back straightened a little, then he closed the album and set it back in its old place, the spine facing out for easy reach. The kitchen counter was clean. On it sat a black gloss pour-over funnel, a stainless steel kettle with a long spout, and a jar of coffee beans sealed tight. He turned the flame low, set the kettle on the stove, and listened to the metal heat rising into a thin band of sound. While he waited, he opened the jar. The smell of raw beans escaped deep and dry. He scooped the beans into the hand grinder and turned it slowly. Each rotation gave a patient scrape. The beans broke evenly, not too fine, not too coarse. The fireplace's crackle blended with the grinding, like two offset breaths that did not argue. Just as the water boiled, he took the kettle off and let it rest a beat to lose its edge. He rinsed the funnel and cup with hot water. Steam rose in a thin veil, fogging the window glass beside it. The grounds lay leveled in the funnel. He poured a small ring of water to wake it up, the aroma opening less smoke, more warmth. He waited about 30 heartbeats, then poured on in steady circles. The dark coffee flowed down. The surface was thick with no stray foam. When he finished, he lifted the funnel and set it on the glazed saucer prepared beforehand so it wouldn't drip on the counter. He carried the cup to the chair beside the brass lamp, where a band of light poured down like a thin shawl. On the small table lay a worn-down pencil and a brown paper notebook with dates listed in his own way. March, tomato seeds. Thursday, children's. Library gate, refastened screw. The lines weren't to remember large things. They anchored small ones, so the day wouldn't drift like a lump of unleavened dough. He sat, both feet placed parallel. His left hand cupped the mug lightly. His right rested on his thigh, palm open. The warmth of the coffee entered the skin and ran through the sinewed wrist. He took a slow sip, letting the soft bitterness reach the tongue first, then a thin sweetness rise after. Outside the window, bare branches stamped their shadows on the gray sky. A sparrow clung to the wire, its small body hunching, then shrinking back as the wind slid through. A sweep hand clock hung on the wall. Instead of tick-tock, it simply shifted quietly, like water moving in an underground pipe. He set the cup on the coaster, the sound crisp, with no excess. His coat hung on the hook by the door. The bunch of keys drooped, the tips touching very lightly each time a draft slipped through the crack. On the shelf, the recorder lay flat, its little light off. It looked more like a peripheral tool than something kept for contingency. Beneath the shelf, the drawer held pens, scissors, tape, paper clips. Everything was in compartments, nothing crowded. He stood and walked down the short hall, his fingertips gliding over the surface of the wooden cabinet to check for dust. The bedroom door was ajar. The blanket was folded in the old way, the top edge and turned down a handspan. The bathroom sink was dry. The towel hung on the bar, the fold facing one way, as if someone had once lined it up so the ends matched. He switched off the hall light. The gold pooled in the corner where the fireplace kept working. Back at his seat, he took the notebook and added a short line after the Thursday entry, a small dot like a reminder to answer himself. There was no complete sentence. He closed the notebook, stroked the spine, and returned it to its place beside the album. He turned the brass lamp down one notch, so the light was gentle enough not to make the room look self-important. In that gentleness, the house held on to the very small sounds, wood expanding and contracting, ash falling in the firebox, paper fluttering as the wind passed through the door crack. He lifted the cup again and finished the rest. The last sip was thicker, warmer. He exhaled without a sound. The morning ritual ended here, not to pretty up a mood, but to set a day upright. What needed to go with him was already in his pockets. As for the house with its golden light, its fire, the album, and Martha's hand, it would remain, quietly supporting the scant part of him no one saw. When he rose, the chair brushed the floor, making just enough sound for him alone to know he was still here, in a house that knows how to keep memory and to hold a person with habits that need no proclamation. At noon, the neighborhood library opened like an old wooden box whose lid someone lifted with a light hand. The air in the reading room warmed with the smell of new paper mixed with the chalky dust of faded posters. Winter light poured slantwise through the frame, stamping pale squares on the carpet. On the low shelves, children's books stood upright, candy-colored spines. A few were slightly askew, making a small rhythm. He spread a striped cloth over the armchair in the children's corner and set a hardback book on his knees. The children sat in a ring, wool hats on their heads, gloves poking from coat pockets still damp with snow. When he opened the book, the paper rustled thinly like dry leaves. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, each word set down like a round pebble, sounding a small note and then lying still. Even those sitting far away could catch the cadence without his needing to lift his throat. One child leaned on a friend's shoulder, one tucked a chin to knees, one twirled the hat string between fingers. He paused at an illustration and pointed with a finger. No explanation, just held it there long enough for the children's eyes to follow the lines. A boy fidgeted, his shoes knocking together with a clack. He dropped his gaze to the page, then raised it just enough, letting the look pass over the boy rather than settle on him. And the fidgeting quieted, the circle closed. At the librarian's desk, May stood behind a tall stack, her hands stamping due dates. Each time the stamp touched the page, there was a soft thump. She watched from a distance, the way he turned pages without creasing them, the way he waited for a child to finish a sneeze before reading on, the way he left a silence between two passages, letting the smile run its full circuit before calling the next page with a light stroke along the book's edge. She didn't chime in. When he closed the book, May had already set on the table a warm water flask wrapped in felt, with a fresh paper cup beside it. No note, no invitation. Just a cap already unscrewed halfway and a smile that touched his eyes and moved on. The lunch break drifted by like a slow stream. The children returned books with plump little hands, blue ink stamps pressed onto checkout slips like small footprints. He folded up the striped cloth and put the chair back where it belonged. While helping a little girl fasten a button, he found a loose thread. He turned the button and slipped it through the hole, unhurried. After she left, the rocking chair trembled lightly where someone had just stood. He set a hand on its back to still it. The afternoon stretched, the light retreating toward the porch. He went to the planter by the library door, where the rose clumps slept through winter, drawn tight in dark soil. A green watering can sat ready at the foot of the stone bench. He poured in just enough water, tilted the can so the stream fell in a soft arc. The earth darkened, hugging the rose's base. With a fingertip, he loosened the crusted surface, breaking the tiny hard shells so water could sink deeper. A dry leaf snagged on a thorn. He freed it, slipped it into his pocket to toss later. Along the curb, crumbs of snow had settled into a stripe. Moisture lifted from the cold ground in a haze thin as stove smoke. The library gate, green-painted iron, had a loose screw on the upper hinge. Each time the wind shifted, it trembled a thin beat. He opened his coat pocket and took out an old wooden-handled screwdriver. The tip bit into the slot. He turned the screw tighter, not forcing it, only enough for the threads to find their proper groove. The small metallic chatter disappeared after a few turns. When he tested it, the gate closed smoothly, like a sentence to which a period had just been added. He wiped the screwdriver tip on his jacket hem, put it away, then set his hand on the gate for a second more to feel the stillness. May stepped onto the porch, arms full of books she had just sorted. She stopped on the step and tilted her head a little, the nod of someone who has seen a thing done right. No praise. She set the stack on the bench, slowly opened the warm water flask she had left at noon, poured into the paper cup, and nudged it toward him the way one launches a small boat into the current by habit. He took it, warmed his hands on the heat seeping through the paper, drank a small sip, the warmth traveling from tongue down into chest. In the little courtyard, circles overlapped. The circle of children sitting at noon, the circle traced by the arc of water falling on the roses, the circle of the screw threads just tightened, the circle of the cup's rim at the lips. Those circles kept a day from shattering. There were no claps, no one to take note, only the smallest changes. The gate no longer rattled, the soil held water deeper. A boy tomorrow afternoon wouldn't trip on a skewed door, a June rose would bow less heavily when it bloomed. When he turned back in, the doormat had dried some. He shook off the snow lightly before stepping on. Inside, the bell at the counter gave a ting in the draft, then fell quiet. May reached to straighten the open hours sign, her fingers sliding along the wooden edge and stopping at the screw now snug. She looked at him for a beat, a smile not wide but warm and enough. At the children's table, the armchair was in its old place, waiting for tomorrow's circle. And he just as every day went on with his small tasks, so the world beyond the door might have a few more places that stand still. The landline rang at midday, a dry metallic vibration in a kitchen still scented with jasmine tea. He wiped his hands on the towel and lifted the receiver. On the other end, a voice identifying itself from his old professional association, polite in timbre but with a ridge to it. They had heard he'd lately had trouble managing his finances and wanted to grasp the situation in order to support him. The word support went through his ear like a wheeled object, rolled across the wooden floor, and stopped at a crack. He gave his name, replied in a few short phrases, and said when they needed documents, they could send a list and he would prepare them. The receiver settled back on the cradle, a small click like closing a lid. In the afternoon, the neighbor woman, a wool scarf around her neck, tapped lightly on the door frame. She stood slightly off to the side, as if so that if her words fell, she could still pick them up. She circled around the topic of medicine, asked whether he needed her to stop by the market for a few sensitive items. Her gaze was kind but hesitant, as if someone had placed a thin string in her hand and told her to give it a testing tug. He thanked her, said he was fine, and handed her a packet of cookies he had baked the other day. She accepted, her eyes resting on the zipper of his coat for half a second. Then she smiled a farewell and backed down the steps. When the door closed, the cold from the porch mixed with the kitchen's butter smell, forming a layer of air with no name. The next day, a social worker came. A woman in her 40s, dark blue coat, low heels, a black folder in her arms. A white label was stuck to the cover, the handwriting neat. He opened the door, invited her in, and took her coat to the hook to keep things tidy. She sat at the dining table, drew out a capped ballpoint pen, and turned one form after another, the checkboxes squared off. Her voice was professional but not stiff. She asked his full name, date of birth, address. He answered slowly but precisely, his hands resting on the tabletop, the knuckles not held too close, as if to show there was nothing he meant to clutch. We'd like permission to see the medicine cabinet. She pitched it low enough that the kitchen wouldn't feel a stranger was there. He led her down the hall and switched on the bathroom light. The mirrored cabinet swung open. The bottles were lined up. Blood pressure, joints, vitamin D, labels noting the start dates. Boxes nearly finished, turned so the printed side faced out. She took each bottle, checked the expiry dates, and ticked the form. On the lower shelf, a box of bandages, a bottle of hydrogen peroxide, small scissors and plastic. Nothing hidden or jumbled. They stood still for a few seconds, listening to the fireplace in the living room crackle like distant rain. Back at the table, she drew another sheet from the folder, 3 lines in bold. "I'm going to ask a few simple questions," she said, eyes lifting with tact. He nodded, breathing evenly. She read 3 words, a kind of fruit, a color, an object in the house, and asked him to repeat them, then moved on to, "What day of the week is it today? What season is it?" He answered, not fast and not trying to seem fast. She asked him to subtract by 7s from a round number. He took a pencil and wrote small figures on the edge of the blotter sheet, each subtraction followed by a tiny tally mark, like marking seeds in a garden. When it came time to recall the 3 words, he said 2 correctly. The third didn't surface at once. He sipped his tea, let the warmth pass through his throat, and then it returned, composed. She nodded. The pen moved. The cap tapped lightly against the folder's edge like a spoon touching a plate. He stood to pour tea again. The ceramic pot was chipped at the handle. The water streamed in a fine thread, steam clouding at the cup's rim. He set the tray in the middle of the table and slid it toward his guest. She held the cup in both hands, thanked him audibly enough, her eyes moving around the kitchen, the towel hanging straight, the small recorder lying still on the shelf, the brown-covered notebook beside it. She wrote a few more lines and asked a few details about expenses, utility bills, bank accounts, who was authorized to be contacted. He took a file folder from the drawer containing copies of what she had asked for, arranged by month and clipped with a binder clip. She skimmed, paused at the emergency contact line, and jotted notes. His heartbeat was steady, like a person crossing a wooden bridge whose steps he had tested beforehand. To the questions about needed support, he answered with small examples. The library gate needed its screws tightened. The rose bed needed loosening. As for the house, he could still manage on his own. There were notes on the refrigerator, not to remind anyone else, but to remind himself. She nodded slightly, sometimes looking up to ask, Has anyone expressed concern? He said he had heard as much from the phone call yesterday. She wrote. When the check was finished, she capped her pen, closed the folder, and rested her hand on the cover for a beat, as if lowering the lid of a thin box. He saw her to the door and handed her coat to her directly. Before leaving, she opened her notebook, tore out a small slip with the on-call number, and told him to ring if needed. Her voice neither dropped nor lifted. It stood level with the tabletop. He took the paper, folded it in quarters, and slipped it into his coat pocket. "Thank you for being thorough," he said, short and clear. She smiled and stepped down the stoop. Wind eddied through the porch. The small bell hanging on the hook rang once, then fell silent. The door closed. The house returned to the sound of the fireplace. He stood for a moment in the entry, his fingertips feeling the fold of the on-call number in his pocket. Then he moved away and filed it in the drawer beside the recorder. On the table, 2 cups of tea, one half full, one drained, had left 2 pale rings. He wiped them with a damp cloth. The rings disappeared like ripples just closed. Rumor, like anything with legs, had walked into his house on clean shoes. But on the floor there was no mud, only the lingering warmth of tea and a breath that held steady, even, and calm. The phone vibrated once on the wooden tabletop, the body sliding slightly and leaving a faint streak of dust. The screen lit up. "Dinner with me tonight?" To discuss some safety options for Dad. The period stood at the end of the sentence, tidy and cold. The word protection sat in the middle, round like a ring someone holds out, saying, "Step in." But the moment a foot crosses, it closes without a sound. He stood still, eyes resting on those 4 words longer than necessary. In his mind, protection didn't appear as armor or a supporting hand. It became a clear plastic cord looped across the back of a chair, along a tabletop edge, around a wrist, not squeezing, but always reminding that someone held the lead. On the window ledge, late light slid along the molding and fell in a slant on the floor. The fireplace crackled, slower, as if to listen. He set the phone face down so the screen would stop glowing. Then he opened the small drawer by the sink, took out the recorder, and set it on the table. The plastic surface was scuffed fine, like the skin of ripe fruit. He placed his thumb on the round button and paused a beat long enough for the blood under the skin to steady, then pressed. A tiny red light came on, a dot like a seed just set in a pot, saying nothing but alive. Sound ran into the device, the sweep hand clock, the breathing of the fire, the rasp of cloth when he moved. He watched that red dot for 2 more beats, then turned it off, pressed again. This time he left it on. Not because he wanted to catch anything, only so the truth would have a shelter starting now, before the words protection cast a long shadow over dinner. He opened the cupboard, took the dried glazed cup, and set it upside down on the rack. His hands worked slowly, skipping no movement. The kitchen towel was tugged straight. The key ring tried the center of his palm and then went into his pocket. He tested the coat's weight, like a tradesman gauging his force before a firm turn. In the inner pocket, the doctor's envelope lay flat, the paper edge aligned with the seam. He didn't take it out or even touch it. Knowing it was there was enough. The smell of cooled tea lingered in the kitchen, thin as a sentence already spoken. He ran cold water into the kettle, rinsed away the old aftertaste, and set it upside down to drain. On the refrigerator, the slip reading Thursday Children's he smoothed flat. The magnet pinned it at a corner that wasn't quite square. He adjusted it by half a hair, bringing it into line. His eyes slid past Martha's frame. He didn't touch it, only nudged it a fraction so the glass wouldn't catch the full glare. In the glass, he saw his own reflection standing straight, right hand on the edge of the table, left hand in his coat pocket, touching the recorder with its light on. He opened the back door and stepped onto the porch, tested the wooden rail. Still solid. Wind slid through the small yard, striking the wind chime into a faint sound like a grain of salt dropping into a palm. From here, the route to the restaurant ran past 2 intersections, an abandoned payphone booth, and a bus stop with a cold metal bench. He rehearsed the way like reciting a coffee formula, the right amount of water, low flame, wait the proper time. The rest, voices, glances, the clink of chopsticks and spoons on plates, would come later. He would not correct them now. Coming back in, he picked up the recorder, looked at the light once more, then slipped it into the inner left pocket. His fingers fastened the pocket button. A neat little click. He passed the table, lifted a fallen thread, rolled it, and dropped it into the trash. The thread was so fine that even hitting the bin's bottom, it made no sound. He opened the upper cupboard, took out a tissue, folded it in quarters, and put it in the same compartment as the recorder. Beside it was a stub of pencil, an old habit. When something needed marking, he would make a light gray stroke, visible enough. Not so dark, it became a blot. The phone lay face down, quiet. He turned it over and replied with a single word. Okay. No time, no questions. Those details belonged to the sender. He set the phone back in its exact place without skewing the angle. Through the glass door, the sky settled one tone deeper, the gray thickening like cloth-bound book board. He put on his coat. Each movement seemed felt-lined. Fasten the buttons, smooth the collar, slide hands into gloves. Before leaving the kitchen, he switched off the ceiling light, leaving the brass desk lamp on low enough that, coming home late, the room wouldn't meet him with darkness. He checked the stove, tested the outlet. Everything still. The lock turned once, the small click blended with the sound of wind passing the crack. At the threshold, he paused half a second and drew a deep breath. In his chest, the warmth of the water bottle May had left at noon seemed still there, enough to resist some of the cold waiting outside the restaurant. Protection was still a ring, but to him, that ring wasn't a place to stand inside. It was a line drawn on the ground. He would step over it, carrying a recorder with a glowing dot, a flat lying envelope, and in silence that knew where to be put. He understood that what was coming was not just concern. It was an intent to set boundaries with another person's hand. His answer would not be in words, nor in noisy defiance. It would be in the way he placed items on the table at the right moment, in the right order. The door closed softly behind him. Inside, the kitchen held its residual warmth. Outside, the pavement was cold, dry, speckled with salt. He stepped down from the stoop, his hand touching the pocket edge where the red light still glowed quietly. Each step was like tightening a screw, one more turn. Snug, but without stripping the threads. And somewhere ahead, a table would have enough light to see the papers laid down, no raised voices, no traps only, so the truth could take its place. The children's room emptied out. The scrape of chairs subsided and then went still. Wool hats left the circle, a few colored threads and the smell of warm fabric lingering on the carpet. He slid the hardback back into the tray, smoothed the edge of the spine flat, and set it neatly on the low shelf. Outside the glass door, the slant of sun had dropped a notch, the bright strip retreating from the table's edge as if someone were drawing back a thin cloth. At the circulation desk, May collected the checkout slips, the due date stamp thumping each page in an even rhythm. She wasn't in a hurry. Each sheet passing through her hands was a rounded, decisive motion. Only when the children had scattered, the noise draining from the room like water from a sandy shore, did May come around the shelf, carrying the familiar felt sleeve around the warm water flask. She set the flask down near him, didn't push it into his hand, didn't say drink. The warmth breathed out and stood there like a small, steady flame. He unscrewed the cap, poured into a paper cup, and cupped it with both hands. The heat traveled through thin skin, touching the taut cords beneath. In his coat pocket, the phone lay quiet, as if still holding a line he had read. Tonight, discuss some safety options for Dad. The knot at his breastbone from those 4 words, protection for, was still there, not stabbing, just holding a steady force. May stood beside him, her eye level even with the table's corner. From her coat pocket, she took a thin white business card, clean-cut edges, and set it down on the table, not into his palm, not with any insistent gesture. The paper had a light tooth, the black type was plain, a person's name, and beneath it a small line, lawyer, volunteer supporting older adults. No logo, no slogan, just a phone number and an email address legible under the light. She leaned slightly and pointed to the card with a ringless finger, her voice low, enough to hear. When you need, call, not to sue anyone. So you have someone to stand beside you. Then she drew her hand back and stood as before, a distance exactly the width of the wooden table between them. He looked at the card one beat longer, not because the words were hard to read, because he needed to move this object through several layers inside himself, past the place where the protection ring had clicked shut that morning, past the spot where strangers' twisting inquiries had landed yesterday, past the butter and tea that still hung in the air of his own kitchen. He set the cup down. The sound on the coaster was crisp. His left hand touched the cardstock. The paper dust clung lightly to his fingertip, like fine sand on skin when you lift your hand from a river's surface. He turned it over. The back was blank. Blank in a good sense. No surplus promises, no list of things to be done on his behalf. May added nothing. She turned to straighten the Storytime Thursday sign that the wind had skewed and pushed the armchair tight to the wall so little feet wouldn't catch it tomorrow. Her motions were like his own, snugged in, lined up, without fuss. If there were a hand placed at his back just now, it was a hand placed alongside, not pushing. He took out his wallet and slid out the children's library card. The clear plastic sleeve was old, a corner slightly nicked. He tucked the business card inside it, shifted slightly to the left so the faded line Thursday could still be seen. Two thin things lay together, making a new thickness but no bulge. As the card slid back into his wallet, the whisper of paper against skin was very soft, just enough for him to hear. In his chest, the tightness loosened by a half a turn, not gone, just less tight. "Thank you," he said, at a volume no louder than the turning of a page. May nodded, the corner of her mouth tilting a smile that asked for no answer. She stepped back, lifted the old book basket, the other hand holding the stamp. She was busy in the way of people who believe that small tasks, done right, are also a form of humane care. He took up the cup and drank another sip. The warmth ran down, and wherever it passed, something unclenched. In the inner coat pocket, the recorder pressed lightly against the doctor's envelope. Two documents with different rolls but the same weight. Set them down and they would make a firm thump. The new card clipped to the library card, a name to call, a voice that could stand across the table. He didn't picture what they would say. He only needed to know that, if needed, there would be someone standing beside him, not holding a leash, not tightening a ring. The library door opened as a small gust slipped in. The hanging bell rang one clear note. He picked a strand of wool from the carpet, rolled it in his fingers, then dropped it into his pocket trash, too small to matter, but he was the sort who carried such things to the bin rather than leaving them to snag on the rose thorns outside. May had returned to the desk. The stack beside her was already sorted by letter. She didn't watch him as he moved toward the door. She let him go the way one returns a book to the right shelf. No reminders, no extra stamp. On the porch, powdery snow lay thin on the steps. He paused and pressed the hinge screw at the gate. It still held the steadiness from his own tightening yesterday. Somewhere in his chest, the dull ache from the word protection eased a degree, like a flame someone had just covered with a glass shade. Not extinguished, but steady. He raised his collar, slid a hand into his pocket, and touched the edge of his wallet. Through the soft leather, he could feel the card and the business card lying against each other. That was enough for him to step down to the sidewalk and go on into the rest of the afternoon. Behind him, the glass door closed softly, keeping the reading room's warmth. Ahead lay the ordinary road of a 72-year-old man, slow, straight, and in his pocket the things that would speak for him when needed, not loud, not pushing anyone, just standing close enough that a person need no longer stand alone. Night fell, and the house drew itself into the narrow band of the brass desk lamp's light. The gold was enough to make the floating dust motes visible like chalk from a blackboard, enough that white paper did not glare. In the living room, the fireplace still crackled lightly, a steady rhythm like a clock hand. He pulled the chair close to the table and set before him a craft paper-covered file folder. In the upper left corner, he stuck a small note scrap, 04B basic documents. Inside, the pages were divided by thin blue-edged tabs. First section, medical conclusion. He smoothed the paper's corner, checked the stamp's ink was dry, the doctor's signature still bold in its stroke. He slipped a copy in right after the original, clipped with a binder clip, a small note on the edge reading, "Copy dining table." His fingertip passed over the long, rough grain of the seal impression. Reassurance entered him without fanfare, like a wool sweater keeping the neck warm. Second section. The social work assessment report. Checkboxes ticked, the handwritten comment column neat. He drew a fine pencil line in the upper corner, wrote the date of their visit, then returned it to sit behind the medical section. The sound of pencil on paper was as soft as dry leaves brushing. Third section. Copies of bank papers, 3 months of statements, a letter confirming updated contacts. Each thin set was clipped separately, the top edge banded with a strip of paper tape labeled "Electric Water Tax." The order was not to show off, only so that when something needed to be produced, the hand wouldn't have to rummage. He took a small craft knife and trimmed the frayed edge of one sheet straight. On the table's edge, the recorder lay face up, its light off. He tapped it. A red dot blinked. Then he switched it off. The battery was still good. He would not record anything tonight. The quiet here needed to remain intact, so that when the time came to switch it on, one would hear exactly what needed to be heard. The business card May had given him this afternoon, he slid under a slim paper clip on the inside back cover. Not on the front page, not buried at the bottom, placed where a hand could reach it when someone needed to stand beside him. He penciled beneath the clip, "When needed, call. Period. Nothing more." He drew from the drawer a separate envelope, thicker, unsealed. On the flap, he wrote, "Personal intentions, library and children's fund, revised will." Inside was thick paper, black ink, weighed words, clean numbers. He read it once in silence, his eyes stopping at the proper names of the weekend reading programs, the line for picture books and primers. He did not picture an opening day or a plaque of thanks. He pictured small hands holding a book with clean edges. He set that envelope distinctly to the right, not folded into the other folder. That separation was a note to himself. Assets are to keep the light, not for tug of war. On the table, he laid out a short contents sheet printed in small capitals. Medical conclusion, original plus copy. Social work, CTH reward, original plus copy. Bank statements plus confirmation letter. Support contact, business card. Will intention, separate envelope. Each line spaced half a knuckle apart. He folded the contents sheet and tucked it into the inner pocket of the folder so that, when opened, it would appear first. Then he closed the folder and ran his hand up the spine to press it straight. Paper rasped very faintly beneath his palm. On the high shelf, Martha's leather-bound album rested as it had since early evening, spine facing out. He glanced at it, did not lift it. Some things remain in their places so the night won't be jostled. He returned to the stub of a pencil, sharpened the tip, blew the shavings into his palm, and tipped them into the trash. The fireplace subsided with a small pop. Ash fell a register almost inaudible unless one sat still. At last he put the file folder in the second drawer on the right, the one seldom used but easy to reach. The will envelope he slid into a separate locked compartment. The key turned once with a just right clunk. Everything was where it belonged. He turned the light down one notch. The gold thinned. At that level, the anger lying somewhere in his chest was no longer burning hot. It had crystallized into straight lines, right angles, binder clips, and clear lines of text. No rostrum, no proclamation, only arrangement. He closed the notebook, laid the pencil along the book's spine, and squared the coaster with the table's edge. When he stood, the chair slid in without a sound. The room held still like a small archive, where everything has a name and a place. And at the center of that stillness, a decision had formed. Tomorrow, if needed, he would simply open the drawer and lay each sheet on the table in the proper order. The rest he would leave to the truth to do its work. The morning after the night of sorting papers, the kitchen was bright just enough to see the edges of the sheets clearly. He set the landline in the middle of the tablecloth and dialed the number written on the social worker's business card. When the other end picked up, he spoke slowly, decisively. "Thank you for being thorough." That was all. No recounting, no further explanation. On the other end, there was the faintest rustle of paper, then a brief reply. He hung up, his finger resting on the phone's cradle for a second, like setting a book back on the right shelf. He opened a drawer and took out the numbered file folder. The copy of the medical conclusion lay right behind the original, its edge fastened with a binder clip. He prepared a blank sheet and wrote 3 short lines. Sent per request to update the file. Enclosed, medical conclusion. His handwriting was compact, with no surplus flourishes. The sheet was clipped on top. He slid everything into a large envelope, pressed the gummed flap tight, then wrote the bank branch's name and verification department. Before leaving the house, he checked the address again, affixed a stamp, and placed the envelope in a canvas tote. Paper brushing the fabric made a muted sound. Outside, it was cold but dry. The street was empty, the lines of road salt glittering like glass dust. The bank branch was 2 blocks away. He didn't go into the lobby. The submission drop box was set along the right wall, its stainless steel lid faintly bright. He slid the envelope through the slot and heard it slide down, a short, dull sound. No one clapped. He simply nodded to himself and turned to go. On the glass door, his passing silhouette was neat as a period. Back on his street, in the neighbor woman's front yard, a small snowblower lay askew, the pull-start cord yanked halfway and snagged. She was fumbling at it, thick gloves making her fingers clumsy. He detoured into his kitchen, opened the oven, and pulled from the metal drawer the tray of cookies he'd baked the night before. The smell of butter and brown sugar still clung to the parchment, then draped a striped cloth over them to keep them warm. He carried the tray over and set it on the wooden railing, motioning with both hands for her to take a break. No need to say anything about the machine. He pulled the fuel release, adjusted the choke lever, pressed the primer twice, and gave the cord a firm yank. The engine whooshed to life and settled into a low hum. He eased the throttle down, pointed to the choke so she could see its position, then stepped back. She slipped off her gloves, breathed into her palms, and smiled. He nudged the tray of cookies toward her, offering a paper cup he had brought from home. They stood on the porch, each taking a bite. The cookies broke crisp, the butter melting slowly. The engine's steady rhythm, like a healthy heartbeat, muffled the "we heard that" phrases that had drifted around for days. By noon, thin sunlight stretched across the sidewalk. He stopped by the library. At the gate, the green-painted iron door shivered whenever little gusts coiled through, revealing a very slight drone from the hinges. He opened his coat pocket, took out a small bottle of lubricant and a cloth. One hand lifted the door to ease the load. With the other, he dripped 2 drops into the upper hinge and 1 into the lower. The oil gleamed brown gold, seeping into the metal threads. He swung the door back and forth and wiped away the excess that bled out to the edge. The squeal vanished, replaced by a closing sound as smooth as a sentence punctuated in the right place. He tested a few more times. Open, close, stop, midway, every motion sounded calm. On the painted surface, the wipe mark from the cloth left a faint halo that would disappear in a few minutes, like a water ring on a wooden table. Inside, May looked up from a stack of books and caught him putting the oil away. She only nodded the nod of someone who understands exactly what has been done. No praise, no verbal acknowledgement. At the children's table, the armchair waited for story time, and she had flipped the rug to hide a worn patch. He tilted his head, checked the row of screws on the door handle, and tightened the 4th by a half-turn for even tension. When he let go of the screwdriver, the metal tip brushed his jacket cloth with a sound so small it was like a comma. Afternoon slowed. He went home the way that cut across the park lawn, where snow had settled in the root hollows like little puddles of milk. In his coat pocket, the bank submission receipt pressed against the brown-covered notebook. At the neighbor's, the snowblower was pushing a neat straight path. At the library, the gate closed softly, so tomorrow a child rushing in wouldn't be startled by a squeal. These weren't big things, didn't need witnesses. But they were his answers set in the right place. at the right time to the thin chords that were quietly looping toward him. He did not argue. He simply made the things that needed to be still, still again. Back in the kitchen, he washed the cookie tray and set it upside down on the rack. The striped cloth hung over the back of a chair, its folded edge straight. The phone lay quiet on the table. There were no new messages. He opened his notebook and added a line beneath Thursday's Children's. Hinge 3 drops. Then he closed the notebook and laid the pencil along the spine. The fireplace let go one more crackle, brief and warm. Out there were rumors and prepackaged safety plans. Here there was a gate that closed smoothly, an envelope that had found the right drop box, an engine that started and butter still lingering on the tongue, enough to let a day stand upright. He spread a thin cloth over the kitchen table, like laying a ground for the final rehearsal. On it, he arranged, in the exact order his hands wanted to remember, the things that would go with him tonight. The small recorder set horizontally at the top, flush with the table's edge. A paper file clipped into 3 parts: medical conclusion, social work assessment report, bank confirmation letter. Each bundle held by its own binder clip, a faintly written note stuck at the upper right corner, and last, the volunteer lawyer's business card, face up so the phone number showed clearly under the brass desk lamp. He stood looking for a while as at a chessboard already set, not to win by a quick move, but so that when his turn came, his hand wouldn't hesitate. He raised his right hand and practiced placing the recorder in position number 1, pressing lightly so the red light came on. With his left, he slid the medical set to the table's edge and set it beside. Next came social work, CTXH. Then bank. Finally, the business card stacked over the upper right corner. After each placement, he drew his hands back and squared the paper edges to run parallel with the wood grain. He repeated the sequence twice more. The third time, he closed his eyes, letting his fingertips find the positions on their own. When everything lay exactly as at the start, he opened his eyes. The paper edges were straight as thin slivers of light, not off by a millimeter. He gathered them up. The recorder went first into the inner left pocket, close to his chest. A quarter-folded tissue laid between to separate it from the wool. The file went into the inner right pocket. The medical face turned outward so it wouldn't need flipping when pulled. The business card he clipped inside his wallet, atop the children's Thursday library card. The 2 thin slips hugged each other, creating just the right stiffness. He practiced reaching into each pocket while his eyes looked out the window. 3 beats. Take the right thing, put it back in the right place, no excess rustle. In the drawer of the cabinet by the table, the thicker envelope, the new will lay still beneath a small bunch of keys. He drew it out and reread the line he'd written by hand. Personal intentions, toward the library and the children's fund. Inside was the printout with numbers, the names of the weekend reading programs bolded. He added no lines, crossed out nothing. He simply slid it back into the locked compartment and turned the key once. The latch's dry clunk was like setting a stone into its socket. On the refrigerator, the slip Thursday Children's was still pinned by an owl-shaped magnet. He smoothed the paper's corner, then passed Martha's frame. He paused half a beat and nudged the frame's edge to line up with the shelf's rim. He didn't touch the glass. In the reflection, he saw himself with his coat half open, the dark wool collar snug at his neck, a man who already knew what he would bring to the table and would say nothing superfluous. He went to the coat rack, slid his arms into his coat, adjusted the shoulders to sit right. His hand ran along the zipper, testing a short stretch. The teeth meshed with a plain, snug sound, the brief speech of metal. Ready. He let the zipper down, pulled it all the way up, then opened it to mid-chest, the position he favored to breathe easily when he needed to speak slowly. The sound repeated, dry, firm, not harsh. He returned to the kitchen, switched off the ceiling light, and left the brass lamp at a middle setting. The gold filled the room's hollows. Table edge, chair spine, cabinet pulls. The cloth still held the faint impressions of the 4 right angles where the folder had lain. He folded it and put it in the top drawer. The kettle was half filled and set on the stove, unlit, a habit of waiting for someone to come home. This waiting wasn't for anyone else. It was for himself so that after a meal he could pour a warm sip without having to turn on the big light. He opened his wallet and glanced quickly at the business card tucked with the library card, a name, a string of numbers, an email address. He didn't read them aloud, only let his eyes skim as if training them to know the path was there when needed. Then the wallet went back into his rear pocket, clicking lightly against a knuckle as his finger tapped it. On the high shelf, the small battery tester lay beside the tin of needles and thread. He pressed it, 2 bars lit enough for one evening. He put it back where it belonged and did not take it along. What needed to be on him was on him. What should stay home would stay home. That distinction kept him from being weighed down. Before leaving the kitchen, he laid his palm on the wood, feeling the warmth left by the movements just made. No proclamation was hung on the wall, only the silent order of papers and objects taking his side. A device that could hold a sound no one could deny, papers with clear inked seals, a business card that would become a voice standing in alignment, and a long envelope at home like a branch of water already set on its course. He pulled the door and locked it. The zipper ran once more, its tight, tidy sound tying the day to a straight line. On the porch, the cold wind was sharp, the light thin as paper. He put his hand into the inner pocket and touched the edge of the file clip hard, cool, shifted to the left, and touched the recorder's body warming with his skin. Everything answered his hand with clear signals. He let his hand drop and stepped forward. The truth was not a flame he meant to brandish. It was a stack of papers that would lie still on the table when needed, in the right place, in the right order. The rest he left to the light above the table and to the zipper's recent sound to speak for him. Ready. The restaurant gleamed like a glass box set down in the middle of winter. On the white tablecloth, knives and forks were arranged into cold, straight lines. Conversation from other tables rose lightly to the ceiling, like rain falling very far away. He was seated in the middle, with no backrest, the server's passage behind him. Opposite sat the family faces he knew, but today their looks had a different glaze. The smell of freshly poured coffee and the orange from dessert mixed together, sweet and sharp. The just being cautious lines began in small voices, then gradually acquired an edge. Slender fingers on the tabletop smoothed the hem of the cloth. A spoon tapped the rim of a cup to steady a tremble. The words protection, safety, procedure marched in a row. When someone said asset, the word slid across the cloth like a knife passing over porcelain glaze. It didn't crack the surface, but it left a chill. He set both hands on his thighs, palms open to the fabric, thumb touching forefinger to steady his breath. In his inner left pocket, the recorder's body pressed against his chest, a quiet dot warming very slowly. A server set down another pot of coffee. Someone turned a cup handle too fast. The brown-black edge ran past the porcelain lip and spilled in a stream. The liquid struck his face head-on, hot and searing, biting the skin like a thin blade of flame. It traced a line from cheekbone to jaw, clung to his collar, soaked into the tie. The bitter smell rose near his nose, pungent and strong. Knives and forks around the table stopped all at once. Chairbacks let out a small squeak. At the next table, a child stopped biting a piece of cake, eyes wide. No one managed a full apology in time. The words broke apart like grains of salt. Oh, goodness, let me. He did not spring to his feet. He did not push his chair back. He lifted the napkin from his lap, folded it in two in one short motion, and set it on the burn. The fabric absorbed quickly, printing a dark patch. He flipped the fold and dabbed again, where the collar had just darkened. The napkin's edge touched the tie. The coffee smell mingled with old laundry soap. A late drop fell onto the bridge of his nose. He tilted his head very slightly so it would fall into the napkin, not onto his chin. His whole body kept the posture it had held from the start back straight, shoulders lowered, eyes not blinking too long. Everyone was looking at him, as if waiting for an outburst so they'd know how to react. But he looked only at his son, not a questioning look, not a look asking for anything. It was a straight cord drawn from his eyes, across the table to that face the same face that had once shone beneath a bicycle helmet at age 5 or 6 in the photo with Martha's caption. At the other end of the cord, his son looked away for half a second, then raised his eyes. His throat swallowed dryly, the stiff collar forming a small ridge. The others laid a layer of words over the space between them. Don't misunderstand. For the future, interests, safety. That layer was thick, but it had no weight against the cord of looking. The searing gave way to a dull sting, like fire retreating into the skin. He lowered the napkin, turned to the dry side, dabbed again at his chin. Coffee still beaded at the tie's edge and rolled slowly, leaving a dark leaf-shaped trace. He caught the last drop with a fingertip so it wouldn't fall to the tablecloth. The movement was so small that only the person beside him saw it. Far off, the coffee machine gave a single whine and fell silent. The overhead light reflected on the plate like a coin. A voice trying to stay calm sharpened on the word guardianship. Pairs of eyes turned to one another, searching for allies among porcelain and cutlery. The word reasonable was as like a lid clapped over a pot at the boil. He didn't interject. In his coat, the file clip on the right kept its shape, the paper edge stiff as a ruler, the thin card in the wallet pressed against the library card so that when he took a deep breath, he could feel a very slight ridge. A younger person meant to touch his shoulder. The hand stopped halfway and withdrew. Perhaps the heat still radiating from his cheek held it back. Perhaps it was the sight of the gaze with which he held that cord. He raised the napkin one last time and set it neatly on the small plate, the napkin's edge not touching the rim. The flush on his cheek was less bright. Under the skin, his heartbeat stayed even, like the sound of a knife wearing at the plate's rim, unhurried, undriven. No full apology was completed. The "only because we worry about you" phrases rushed to fill the gap like a sponge drawing water too fast. The server came and awkwardly offered a cold towel. He accepted it, pressed it gently to the hot spot, and gave a short nod. The towel's mint scent rose and covered part of the bitterness. He set the cold towel back exactly on the plate with the paper doily beneath so the tabletop wouldn't get wet. When the just being cautious turned to making a plan, he set his right hand on the edge of his inner pocket without taking anything out, just set it there. A quiet confirmation. Everything was here in its place. The light reflected in his son's eyes was cut in half by the shadow of a water glass. He kept looking at the remaining half. A small point of light, enough to catch hold of. No need to raise his voice, no need to ask anyone to stop talking. His silence with the coffee-reddened cheek drew a clear boundary around the table. The crowded room stayed noisy, but the sound receded as if behind a layer of glass. The revolving door at the entrance, shoes on the wooden floor, cutlery on porcelain, all of it turned into backdrop. He sat there, straightening the tie's crease with a finger, wiping the last streak on the collar. Then he returned both hands to his thighs, back straight. No one spoke asset in that moment anymore. If they did, the word dissolved on the tongue when it met a surface that would not take hold. And before everything turned to papers and proof, there was time to see this. A 72-year-old man, just splashed in the face with hot coffee, still looking only at his son as if there, and only there, was the place worth resting his eyes. He set the damp napkin down on the plate, his right palm sliding lightly into the inner left pocket. His fingers touched the familiar plastic body. He drew the recorder out and set it in the center of the table, right at the edge of the lamp's spill where it made a round pool. His thumb found the play button. A small click. The red light came on, and then the sound poured out, sharp as glass. A young voice, slightly lowered but not enough to hide. "We have to prove he's confused. Don't let him have time to react." Then a short, suppressed laugh from someone. The clear, distant clink of glasses, a spoon scraping the side of a cup, a chair sliding on the floor, all the accidental sounds that come attached to intention. At the next table, cutlery halted in midair. The server who was pouring water froze, the last drop hanging at the lip of the carafe. The coffee machine's noise seemed to retreat behind a pane of glass. The room fell quiet on its own without anyone giving a signal. On the table, light caught the recorder's body in a thin streak. The little red light blinked steadily, each blink a period. He didn't look around. He fixed on one point only, his son's eyes. In those pupils, the tiny recorder's body appeared too, a bright red dot. His son's hand drew in, a fingertip hooking the fold of the tablecloth, pulling out a thin thread and letting it go. A tendon stood out in his neck like a string tuned to the wrong pitch. He let the audio run long enough that sentence was no longer just a sentence, but a structure with context. The clinking glasses, someone's breath as they laughed, the sound of a chair. Then he pressed stop. The light went out. He nudged the recorder a fraction, as if only to line it up with the wood grain. No one ventured it was just a misunderstanding. That phrase, if it existed, could find no purchase on a tabletop this flat. His left hand left his thigh and opened the inner right pocket. A thin file slid out, the paper edges carrying the scent of dry ink. He set it on the table, pushed it toward no one, turned it to face no side. He simply laid its edge flush with the tablecloth's border. First page, medical conclusion, a deep blue round stamp, the doctor's signature decisive. He smoothed it lightly. The paper gave the faintest rasp. On top of it, he placed the social assessment report. Checkboxes marked, the line sufficient capacity to manage finances, written neatly in black pen. Each sheet meeting the tabletop made a very slight sound, together forming a rhythm. Finally, he drew out the volunteer lawyer's business card. The white stock, clean-cut edges lay stacked on the upper right corner of the two sets of papers. It was not a threat. It was a name at the ready, a hand that did not need to be called loudly to hear. The restaurant manager appeared from behind the counter as if he had been there all along, carrying a clear envelope and a small photocopier on a cart. He stopped beside the table, leaned slightly, and lowered his voice enough that it wouldn't carry to other tables, asking permission to keep a copy in case a witness is needed. His eyes sought neither a contract nor a culprit. They sought the right course for a room holding still. He nodded. "Thank you for doing the right thing," he said, soft as half a breath. The manager nodded back and carried the papers away. The copier gave a short beep and then fell quiet, leaving only the roller's light glide, like a fish slipping under the surface. On the table, the spoons lay still as if set for this very minute. A younger person at the table reached to gather the papers and drew back halfway, fingers hovering in the air, then dropping to cradle a water glass. Beside the glass, the glazed rim bore a dried coffee stain, dark brown. No one wiped it. His son looked down, then up, his gaze searching for a handhold in the ceiling, the lights, the menu, anything that might take the weight. There was none. Between them, there remained only the flat tabletop and the pages already in the right order. He did not push them toward anyone. He left them there, like laying a straight edge across a drawing with the wrong curve. The manager returned and set the clear envelope of copies at the table's edge, parallel with the plate's rim. He said quietly that he had kept a copy at the counter if a comparison is needed. The sentence carried no weight beyond its function. He nodded. His fingers touched the envelope's corner, felt the cool plastic. He nudged it a little toward the center so it wouldn't slip. Around them, talk at other tables began again, not loud, like after a minute's silence. At his table, the knives and forks stayed still. He picked up the recorder, switched it fully off, and set it on top of the stack. A thin layer of plastic on a thin layer of paper on a thin layer of timely silence. He turned to the server, holding the extra cold towel, and gave a slight nod. She set the towel on the plate and stepped back. He looked at his son for one beat more, like a tradesman checking whether a newly driven nail sits flush. In that look, there was no longer any flaring anger, only a hard surface, enough that the words protection, guardianship, on touching it, would not catch. The cord between the two of them did not break. It simply stopped being tugged by other hands. When he gathered the papers, no one stopped him. The file went back into the inner pocket. The recorder returned to its place against his chest. The business card still lay on top, sliding along like a leaf carried by the current. "Thank you for doing the right thing," His words lingered on the tabletop longer than the smell of coffee. People went on with their meal, but the taste had changed. The faint metallic tang of truth and the silence after the ring of glasses, the kind of silence that knows how to hold a place for justice without anyone raising a voice. A few weeks later, winter noon stood still outside the glass, like a thick piece of cloth. Inside the library, the children's corner opened as always, the wool rug freshly washed, the armchair set in its proper corner, the low shelves lined with candy-colored spines. He spread a striped cloth over the chair's arm, sat slightly angled so the light from the desk lamp poured onto the page without his hand casting a shadow. The children gathered into a circle, knit caps dangling from the pegs by the door, gloves laid along the radiator ledge to dry out. He opened the hardback. The paper gave a faint pop, like snowflakes touching a door. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. Each sentence was set down like a round pebble rolling to its stop. A boy sat at the rug's edge, fingers twirling a shoelace. A girl tilted her head so her bangs wouldn't fall into her eyes. The smallest had already nodded off, forehead resting on her sister's shoulder. He paused at an illustration where a band of sunlight crossed a window, holding his index finger at the picture's edge a beat longer, like a grown-up waiting for a child to have time to squint and look closely. Midway through the story, a small hand rested on the back of his, warm, light, unasking. He didn't turn his head. He only lowered his wrist a centimeter so that hand could lie fully on his sinewed surface. The child's breathing was even, the scent of baby soap faint. Somewhere in his chest, the old knot loosened, like a loosely tied parcel now deftly undone. He kept reading, the pace of his words slowing by half a notch, enough for that hand to be like a small wave easing the words along. At the circulation desk, May turned the return list, the due date stamp tapping down in its familiar solid rhythm. She glanced up for a moment, caught the small hand on the back of his, then bent to her work again. Between two stamp beats, she quietly drew the donation box closer to the children's shelves and straightened the sheet that read, "Weekend Reading Program, Donate as you wish." When the story ended, the children flowed out like water, each carrying a still warm scrap of image. He closed the book, patted the spine lightly so it wouldn't warp, and put it back in its proper place. The small hand withdrew without a sound. The child buttoned her coat and ran to the door, leaving a trace of warmth on the back of his hand like late sun on the edge of the rug. He gathered the striped cloth, tilted the armchair to true its leg, then walked past the donation box. Inside, a few bright coins, 2 bills folded into quarters, a sticker of an owl with one corner peeled. On top lay a thin white envelope. No name, no words. The flap had been smoothed flat, as if the hand that set it down meant for it to lie still, not rise above the other things. He paused a second, didn't touch it, only took in the way it lay close to the bottom, like a voice you can hear if you press your ear near. May came over, lifted the box lightly, checking. She didn't open the envelope. She used 2 fingers to press the corner straight, letting it settle fully to the bottom. Her eyes passed across him with a very small nod. No one said anything about who sent it. No need. The envelope's presence was in the weight it added to the wooden box, a weight that made no sound. The afternoon stretched by a few more shades of gray. On the porch, the library gate closed softly without a squeak. The oil had found the right threads. The children collected their coats, pulled on hats, pushed the door, and ran out. The wind chime rang once and stopped. He squared the rug, picked up a red strand of wool, rolled it into a little pellet, and dropped it into the trash. In his coat pocket, the library card clipped with the lawyer's business card lay flat. In the drawer at home, the envelope of the new will sat settled. On the reading table, the book he had just told had returned to being an ordinary spine among 100 others. He stood at the glass door for a moment, looking at the white stripe of salt on the sidewalk. The small hand felt as if it were still resting on the back of his. That feeling went with him as he eased the door open and stepped out. Cold wind rasped along his collar. The smell of book covers and clean carpet still lingered in his breath. Behind him, the donation box held one more nameless envelope. Ahead, the road led back to a kitchen with the brass lamp already on. Between those 2 points, a 72-year-old man carried a small streak of warmth enough to read another chapter tomorrow, and enough to need no explanation at all for justice. It had found its own way by a small hand and an envelope that lay quietly without a name. He came home when the evening had deepened, the smell of late sun clinging to his collar mixed with the dried coffee. In the kitchen, the brass desk lamp was set low, its gold pooling on the wood, enough to see the edges of the cloth and the stitching on a shirt. He took off his coat, touched the darkened patch at the collar and lapel. The bitterness had cooled, but the smell remained like a sentence not yet ended. He turned on the warm tap, let it run until a thin steam rose, then soaked the fabric in the white enamel basin. Soap bubbles rose in tiny grains, clinging to the weave like snow settling on an eave. He rubbed lightly, turning his wrist in even circles so the fibers would release a pale brown. The water clouded, then cleared. He wrung the shirt, water fell in straight drops, hitting the basin with soft plops. Behind the kitchen, a clothesline was stretched taut between two wooden hooks. He clipped the shirt with two old wooden pins, adjusted the shoulders to hang straight, the lower edge touching the warm air left from the stove. The water kept dripping in a beat, then eased. A light wind slipped through the back door crack, touching the fabric with a rustle like pages turning. On the shelf, the recorder lay in its old place. He lifted it, wiped the surface with a dry cloth to take the damp from his hand. The small light came on when his thumb touched the button. There was no longer the clamor of the meal, no clink of glasses. The kitchen was so quiet, even the clock hand seemed to recede into the wall. He brought the device close to his mouth and spoke slowly, clearly, as if reading out a penciled note. Tomato seeds, March. He paused a beat, letting March settle. Then added, so, borrow more Maurice Sendak. 2 short lines, enough to give tomorrow a specific task and to give tonight a straight line to hold. He pressed stop. The machine returned the very silence he needed. He set it beside the brown-covered notebook, the pencil lying along the spine, its freshly sharpened tip still fragrant with shavings. In the locked drawer, the envelope of the new will was still in place. He did not open it or even look, only touched the cabinet's edge lightly, the way you touch a familiar wall each time you pass. Outside, tires ground over a thin layer of salt, then stopped. Headlights swept a band of light across the curtain's edge, tilted over the frame on the shelf, left a pale spot on the glass, then slid away. The engine idled evenly at the gate, waiting half a beat. The phone on the table was quiet. No messages, no apology. He stood by the sink, his hand on the kitchen towel, his pulse as calm as when he counted the screws on the library gate. The headlights slanted away, the car pulled off, the engine sound dwindled, blending into the eddying wind between the row houses. He went back to small tasks. He dried the damp patch on the tabletop, squared the coaster that was off by half a finger, and nudged the chair tight to the table leg so it wouldn't snag. The kettle was filled halfway and set on the stove, but not lit. His fingertip touched the body, felt it cold, then moved away. He opened the cupboard, took down the porcelain cup with the worn rim glaze, and set it on the coaster right under the brass lamp's beam. By the window, he raised the curtain one notch so the darkness of the porch would not pour too far into the kitchen. On the rack, the sweater that had dried since morning was folded in half, its edge aligned with the cloth's stripe. He closed the drawer that held binder clips, scissors, tape. Everything was in its place, like seeds in envelopes labeled with the month. Snow began to fall again, small and even. Through the window pane, it clung to the stair edge in a thin white line. The brass lamp still shone at a moderate level, its gold pooling on the tabletop into a visible patch of warmth. He went to the back door, checked the lock, then came back in and set the top latch. As the door closed, the bolt dropped into place with a soft sound like a hand setting a book on the right shelf. No message arrived, no late call. He realized he no longer needed them, not out of anger, but because the day already had enough to stand upright on. A shirt slowly drying out its coffee smell, a recorder returned to its small work, an envelope lying still in the place kept for the light of reading hours. He switched off the ceiling light, leaving the brass lamp to pour gold across the wood. The kitchen was warmer by that part, and that part of warmth was enough to keep for tomorrow. He sat down, back straight, laid his palm on the warm tabletop. Outside, the snow fell steadily. Inside, the golden light did not tremble. His breath went in and out like a gentle stream. When he rose, he touched the switch lightly. The door closed softly. The warmth that remained hung in the room like a coat drying in the dark unseen, but by morning it would be dry and it would fit. In the end, no one won anyone over with words. There were only papers set in their proper place, a manager asking to keep a copy, the library gate closing softly after a few drops of oil, and a small hand laid on the back of an old hand. Revenge, if it must be named, turns out to be the gentlest kind of payback, returning silence to where silence belongs, returning autonomy to one's own hands, and returning the bright portion of a life to weekend reading hours. The coat has been washed clean of the coffee smell. The recorder has gone back to its old work, noting tomato seeds for March. Borrow more, Maurice Sendak. The envelope of the will rests quietly in the drawer like a lamp under a glass shade. On the counter, the donation box holds one more nameless envelope. Outside, the snow falls steadily. Inside, the brass desk lamp glows just enough, a day standing upright. If you have ever chosen to retaliate with straightness and with small acts tightening a screw, leaving an envelope, or simply by not raising your voice, tell one small detail of your own in the comments. No name needed, no long explanation, just an image, an action. Who knows, amid so much noise, your quiet story may be what helps someone stand upright again, like a hinge that stops squeaking in the night.